All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to my podcast. So, that'd be good. That'd be cool if I had a podcast. Um, I don't know how podcasts work. How do people do podcasts? But what I wanted to talk about. Oh, by the way, I made for those of you who don't know, which you know, out of the three of you who watch this, uh, two of the three I talk outside of this, and so I already think I already told you about the video I sent you. But I made this beautiful capybara montage, an homage to the capybara, the most beautiful, largest rodent in the world, in the known universe. But it didn't format right, so I tried to upload it on here, and it looked kind of shitty, so I deleted it. And then I made this other video, which I might put in the background of this, but yeah, I didn't want to upload that one either. Um, but so I figured, maybe I'll just get into a subject that I was planning on talking about weeks ago. So weeks ago, I watched the docuseries called Unabomber in his own words. And then I got interested in more about Ted Kaczynski and what his actual philosophy was. And I was going to read his manifesto, or I decided it'd be easier to just listen to it. So I listened to that, Industrial Society and Its Future. I listened to it on YouTube, audio format. And yeah, I was just really interested in his ideas. And so yeah, listened for whatever, over 3 hours. And then I just started writing about it, and I ended up typing about 4 pages, and I was gonna just read it and put it in a YouTube video, but I just didn't really feel excited about that. I guess I don't really enjoy when I'm really reading from a script sort of thing. It's like it felt like I already had done it. I wrote the thing and it was already done, and so then I guess I'd be sharing it with you by reading it to you, but at least for me personally, there little new revelation would come on my end from just reading something that I wrote. Kind of when I just talk about things randomly, sometimes I stumble upon maybe a new way of seeing something or thinking about something, and it's just more fun to make the video anyway when I don't really know what I'm going to be saying exactly. Um, so, but I still wanted to talk about it. And the other topic that I want to talk about today, and I'm going to kind of connect the two, or try to, is that I think love is bullshit. I don't think romantic love is a real thing. And I don't mean that in the sense that, of course, you have had romantic feelings before. Of course, we can point to people who seems like whatever is working out for them. But just as a general thing, the way we define and see modern romance, the way most of us kind of see it as this almost a mystical, mythical, whatever, I don't know what the right word for it is, but this thing that is rooted in some sort of higher place, some sort of purity, I think can develop maybe over time. I think a married couple, a couple that's married for 20 years, maybe they've developed through their trials and tribulations, they've developed a bond, a trust in each other. Maybe they're both willing to put their lives on the line to protect each other, or things that I would find admirable and that I would then, in my mind, quantify it as real love. I think that can exist. I think that's, semi rare, maybe becoming more rare. But I think especially the initial stages of love, I don't even just mean the first week or 2 weeks or month. I mean, even the first 2 years, it's not even, it's not real love. When you see sometimes in the movies, it always disturbs me when a guy just meets a girl and he's already, like, it seems like in 2 seconds. Of course, in the time frame of the movie, it's 2 seconds, but even in terms of the time that they're representing in the movie, it might actually have only been a day. The guy seems to be willing to die for this woman. Why? Because he likes her skin suit. I mean, the absurdity, the foolishness that, his horniness, I guess you could say, whatever evolutionary things going on there, the foolishness involved in willing to lay your life down for someone that you just met, mostly because she has a hot body or whatever, is just fucking ridiculous and destructive. But I think it is telling, even though it is just something that might be portrayed in a TV show or a movie. whether or not we get our cues from the movies or the movies gets their cues from the culture. I mean, it somewhat goes hand in hand. Maybe it's a sort of I'm sure there's a degree of interchange there where we're feeding these messages that then get put in the movies by the director and so on, or the movies sort of portray a certain idea of things for whatever reason. Maybe it's more entertaining. So whatever way the directors think something's going to be entertaining is then what we take in as a culture as being somewhat of a representative of what we think reality is, or at least should be, or would be in an ideal situation. But the way this relates back to Ted Kaczynski's manifesto, which, I can't get into all the details now because I'm not going to make a 2-hour video here, but the one topic I wanted to really focus on, at least for now, in his manifesto, I'll probably make other videos in the future getting into details about other aspects, was this concept he has of surrogate goals. And basically, Kaczynski thinks that, technology is essentially the root of all evil, and there's no way to even have it in moderation. And one of the many things that is a problem with technology in his eyes is we become a culture, a society that's all about surrogate goals. And we find these, we want to get a better golf score. We want to get a six-pack. We want to get the latest and greatest car or whatever gadget. Or we just come up with other goals that are kind of like, at their core, meaningless. And, the real goals would be survival, right? Protecting your family, building shelter, hunting for food, those main survival things that you need to do, those would be the real sort of goals in his mind. I don't know what he would call, I don't know what term he would use, but those would be goals that have real value, that mean something. And because we've gotten so far away from that, because things are so easy the way he sees it, everything's sort of handed to us in a way. I don't know that I agree with all of this necessarily, but he's basically saying more or less most of us in this culture aren't worried about we're not going to starve to death most likely, and he sees this as a problem. Like I said, there's way more to his manifesto. There's way more to his criticism, his issue with technology. It's not just him saying, things are too easy and that's it. No, I mean there's, like I said, I might make a separate video just going into all the things he talks about with what are and what could become problems with technology and how they kind of destroy our humanity, including sort of becoming becoming sort of robotic in cubicles with no power, and just kind of doing that sort of, whatever 9 to 5 meaningless task thing on repeat forever. But I want to get more into surrogate goals because my issue that I had with his manifesto, and this part of it in particular, was this idea that hunting for food would obviously be so much better than these surrogate goals. I think there is a problem with the surrogate goals. I think there's a problem with the underlying sort of sense of meaninglessness in life, and I think that problem has probably been around forever. To an extent, as far as humans became more thinking and questioning things, which is why different religions came up and evolved, and why religion is still a big thing today, and why some people, find a religious conviction in their politics or other things. I think this is always potentially going to be a problem humans have to face. How do we cope with this sense of either life feels like it has no inherent purpose or meaning, or we find it in religion, which a lot of us have our own sort of issues with if we don't believe it to be true, for example, or if we find it to have its own drawbacks and it makes people behave in ways that we find undesirable, unpleasant in some way. But back to the idea of surrogate goals and comparing that to his idea of, life would be okay if we were just kind of relaxing in between our hunting and gathering and sitting around the campfire. That in itself becomes sort of boring and empty. And I would argue that, Kaczynski himself was bored of doing that, right? I mean, he was out there, I guess, by and large, living this lifestyle. I mean, I know I've seen pictures of his cabin where he certainly had products made by industrial society, and maybe he would argue that, well, he didn't yet get to the full, he didn't yet have the skill set to completely survive without some help from industrial society, or that the way the landscape is, the way the laws are, he can't necessarily just make his way with hunting and whatever, and that's it's society's fault that it doesn't create an environment that he could survive in the way that he would like to survive. If technology didn't exist, maybe he'd be just fine without buying whatever products he still seemed to have. But then besides that, what I'm really getting at is, he needed the higher purpose of fighting against technology. He needed to I don't think that he was just so full of empathy and so heroic that, he would have just loved sitting in that cabin all the time in between his hunting, and he would have just been cool, just relaxing, had it felt good about it, and that, but he was just, for heroic reasons, he had to start, blowing people up and stuff. I think part of it, without getting too into saying, oh, well, did he have this or that mental illness, this and that in his childhood, all of which may be true, but at the real point is, it wasn't satisfying enough to him to just sit around by the campfire, to just sit out in nature. He might have enjoyed it, and I think he did get great pleasure from some of those things, but it wasn't enough. He had to do some crazy shit and blow some people up. And like I said, I'm sure he has he'd give all his justifications on why this is him trying to start a revolution, trying to start a way that, so he had issues where he wanted revenge against people in his community who were destroying the land and all kinds of other things. But, without getting too deep into the fact that a lot of his terrorist, whatever you want to call it, killing actions don't really make sense with regard to the fact that he didn't go after people that are obviously immoral people. So at least on the surface, I can't see how they were obviously particularly morally bankrupt. They were people that were involved with technology in some way, so he was trying to send a message and make a point. But anyway, I guess we don't really need me to say the obvious and saying that, not the best way to send a message, in my opinion, even though obviously it did get him attention. It got his manifesto published because he then used it as sort of, he threatened to do more killings if he didn't get it published and so on. But the thing is, we wouldn't really want to go back to that, I don't know, call it caveman lifestyle, but we don't want to go back thousands of years ago where we didn't have running water technology, where there's no grocery stores, where we're hunting every day for our food. There are endless problems and lots of things that I actually find very compelling and agree with Kaczynski about, as far as the damages that technology causes, ranging from the environment to just our humanity, the way sort of the system works. Whether it's capitalism or not, we somehow end up becoming these sort of powerless robots and cogs in a machine, and which seems to lead to a lot of unhappiness and just a lack of general autonomy and power and so on. But to say that it's almost as a disservice to his criticism to sort of then say, oh, well, let's compare this current existence to one where we we have none of this technology, and we're constantly in the face of potential death. We have no technology. We've eliminated all forms of technology, and that is going to appeal and seem like a more pleasant lifestyle. It almost gives credibility to sort of maybe the most egregious offenders that contribute to this sort of society that he maybe with validity has valid criticism of. He almost lends them credibility by saying, oh, look, if you're against this society, if you see the dangers of technology, if you see the way we're losing our humanity, maybe you're a batshit crazy terrorist who lives out in the woods and is irrational. That's why it was very important to him when he went to trial. He did not want to plead insanity because he didn't want to discredit his work. to me that never made any sense. Now, of course, maybe he doesn't need to make sense because he obviously probably does have a couple screws loose to do the violent actions that he took. But he also was a very or is a very intelligent person. But why would he care so much about pleading insanity that would damage his credibility with his ideas when his bombing itself did irreparable damage to his ideas? Yes, some people eventually, a lot of people I'm sure read his manifesto just like I did, or listened to it, or heard his ideas and found them compelling, but clearly not enough to really make. It doesn't seem to, from my perspective, I don't feel like today our technology is being slowed down in any way due to Ted Kaczynski. Um, Now, maybe some of his writings are a catalyst for some people to have some alternative ideas about different ways of living or different concerns about where technology is headed and how it's already sort of causing us to feel empty and depressed and make it kind of stripping away our humanity. And some people criticize capitalism to blame. And, he said it's not capitalism's fault, that it's technology, that technology inevitably leads to these places where, these problems exist. But either way you frame it, I don't think in the grand scheme of things, it's his actions had a huge impact. But I think also, yes, your message inevitably is going to get pushed out of the mainstream, and really to make a big lasting change like he wanted, it would have to get deep into the mainstream, would have to adopt his ideas, and that was not going to happen when you're blowing people's hands off and killing people who aren't even clearly particularly bad people in by any sort of reasonable person's standards. Um, but yeah, so how do I connect this all back to the original idea when I'm talking about love? And I don't think love really exists. Uh, Love in itself, I do agree. It's almost like, not that he didn't really go too deep into this, but I see love, this pursuit of love, of romantic love, is in itself almost a surrogate goal. And I do think that there is a problem there. So I do think that there is some truth to this idea that when we're desperate for these surrogate goals, when we do get so far away from just our basic fundamental survival, we kind of lose touch with who we are as people. Like, hey, we're people who want to eat, we want to survive, we want to fuck, we want to protect our families. When we start getting way outside that realm, we sort of lose sight of, we sort of lose touch and get confused with who our basic nature. And this is why I have such a problem with every sort of like self-help or kind of, people that are supposedly full of life wisdom. It's always talking about goals. You need to have goals for yourself. And I've talked about this myself because I do struggle with the idea of, how do you keep motivated to keep going on living in a world and a life that seems to be sort of redundant and full of suffering. But I do think there's a problem with this thing. I mean, I've had, talking in the romantic context, women all the time will talk about they want a guy with goals and ambition. Now, of course, I might argue, and others might argue that's code for they want a guy with money. But even if we put that aside, I think a lot of people they think it's sexy. It's when someone has goals. They're going places. They have goals. But the thing is, we're not going places. We're all going nowhere. Even the people that accomplished such great things and had all kind of goals and they reached their goals, so they sometimes end up killing themselves because, they get fucked over in some way or they feel their psychology is off for whatever reason. And I just think this idea of goals, where are we going? And you got to have accomplished things. I don't know about that. I mean, I think, what if people were more passionate about, like, just being decent people? Now, maybe that's not enough either, right? Maybe that's still going to end up. But what if people... The problem is we used to associate being a good person, or a lot of people did or still do, with you being religious. And then once religion sort of has died, I would say, in this country, even though I've talked about this before, it's clearly not dead in terms of most people would still identify as Christian, but secularism, even within people that would identify as Christian, I would say pretty much is ruling people's lives. I mean, people are mostly ruled by secularism, materialism, and so on. I would say it's actually a minority of people at this point that are really feel like I really feel like their religion and spirituality is like the number one or really up there in how they live their lives. I mean, even people that claim to be religious oftentimes seem to really be way more dedicated to some sort of individualist materialism or whatever you want to call it than some sort of higher purpose in life. But what if even if you weren't religious, or even if you are religious, it was like the goal was about learning to be good, and that's a whole nother conversation. What does it mean to be good? But whatever that means to you, I mean, we read these books sometimes, these self-help books, or we look for wisdom, or we look for even in the romantic context, we don't people don't really look for who has the best character, right? And this is another reason why I think I have some skepticism about the romantic thing is it's so very, very rarely do, at least in modern culture, is that really the pursuit, right? You would think that at least love, in my mind, in its pure form, would be hopefully related to some sort of thing that you were attracted to someone's character. And not that it doesn't matter that they're funny or that they're intelligent or other things that people seem to find attractive, but it really does seem to, when push comes to shove, character seems to be so far down the list. The person seems being really genuinely caring, empathetic, loving, compassionate, thoughtful, reliable, all these things. And I'm not trying to virtue signal here and claim that I am the epitome of all these things by any means. Some of those things I'm better at than others, for sure. Probably lacking in some of those ways at times, and maybe exceeding average standards in other of those ways. So don't want to present it like I'm saying that I am the epitome of this, or that even in my romantic pursuits that I do this. I'm proposing this as just an idea, not saying that this is how I live my life. I'm saying maybe it is how I should live my life, or maybe at least moving more towards that direction. But I think what we really see, though, regardless of whether this is just a modern phenomenon, how do I say that? Phenomena? Regardless if this is just a modern thing or it's always been the case. I mean, I would expect it's not just a millennial thing, this sort of shallowness that we have, but maybe it's become exacerbated. I'm trying to use big words, but I'm afraid that I'm saying exacerbated by by the messages we get from sort of reality TV culture and dating apps and so on. But I guess the real point I'm making here, connecting the dots between surrogate goals and modern romance, is that I think there is eventually going to have to be, or at least there's going to be the desire to be, some sort of revolution back to simplicity in some way. And I think we see this happening in little pockets of society. We see people understanding it on some level. There's some rebellion against social media. There's some pushback, certainly. People are definitely talking about the way it's damaging. There are people who, they're into the tiny house idea. I think it's a cool idea, but there's some people who are actually living it, that are going and building tiny house. There's minimalism, regardless of whether you live in a mansion or a tiny house. That's its own kind of thing. Now, I think what I'm arguing is that these things connect. Whether it's tiny house living, minimalism, whether it's some people sort of feeling social media fatigue or dating app fatigue, there's going to eventually be some sort of revolution. I don't think it's going to look like Ted Kaczynski's vision. I don't think we're going to completely overthrow technology, even if it would take a lot of people to really get pretty desperate to be willing to go to that extreme. But there will be some sort of revolution. I mean, even when you look at talking about things like climate change or whatever, regardless of whatever your position is politically on that, as far as what you think should be done about climate change, there's almost arguments to be made. There are arguments to be made on all sides of the political spectrum of a need and desire to simplify. And sometimes I feel like it's strange how the right and the left don't seem to at least acknowledge parts where the different areas where they would overlap in desire, like sort of like when conservatives, and this might be going way off the rails a little bit in terms of this conversation, what I'm talking about, but conservatives who will talk about family values, and how stay-at-home moms are a good thing, and let's get back to the 1950s tradition and whatnot. But they kind of support a capitalistic society where money takes priority over family, and they'll say, well, you should move to wherever the work is, and it's the land of opportunity, and it doesn't matter if families break up and live in different cities. And that's just one example where the right and left, you would think they would see the point where they align, where if you care about family values, if you want people to have a family where they can afford to have children, have a stay-at-home mom, families that live together in communities, they're not moving all over the place, that you would want to create a society where there are enough people that have jobs, that are stable, that make enough money to allow that sort of 1950s vision to even take place to begin with. And I think there are probably people are realizing this in some ways, and but I think what almost happens at some point is like the right will adopt certain values of the left, and then the left almost feels like they need to fight against that, or the opposite. The left could adopt, maybe the left at some point will adopt like some idea of, yeah, family does matter, and that's why we need this, and then maybe the right will get a whatever it is. I feel like in the end, people especially, at least in this country, it's party over principle. It's not about people being principled. It's about people, they've identified their enemy, which is whoever is in a certain political party. And, in my opinion, unfortunately, it doesn't even matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Most likely, what I've found is the reasons that people have for being one or the other are usually pretty stupid. I don't know, maybe that's oversimplifying it, but they're just kind of, at least to me, they don't seem really thought out or even mildly questioned or looked into. It's just kind of like, well, of course I'm a Democrat, of course I'm a Republican, because I see the world this way. And it's just kind of like Democrats and Republicans both just sort of buy into different cliches and tropes and platitudes of the party that don't mean anything. But anyway, that's kind of veering off track here. In the end, I think the idea of surrogate goals is something I'm interested in. This idea of, is it really a good thing that we feel compelled to create these sort of arbitrary goals so that we can feel meaning and purpose in our lives. And for some people it works. For me it doesn't, because it does feel like Kaczynski describes, it does feel fabricated. It does feel like bullshit oftentimes. It's like, oh, well, I gotta find a way to distract myself. I gotta way to distract myself from the emptiness of this existence. So let me just create some goals for myself. And it irritates me too, just how much people are not just into this. Sometimes when I've talked to women, I don't want to date a guy without goals. Like I said, maybe that's code for they don't want to date a guy without money, or maybe they think they don't want to date a guy who's not passionate about anything. I can see how that can get kind of boring if he doesn't get excited or interested in anything or whatever. But I just think it's not thought out. I think it's overrated. This idea that these sort of arbitrary goals are important or sexy, or that's what our mental health is about. I mean, a lot of these ideas, if they really worked, I guess, and I shouldn't say this, they probably do work for some people, whatever generic ideas come from self-help books. But if it really was as simple as finding a hobby, creating a goal for yourself, we would all just find our goals and then go pursue those goals, and we'd be fine. But there's a deeper problem, and I think getting to the root of that can lead to some revelations about society as a whole, but even our individual lives, how we can lead it in a more fulfilling way by kind of really focusing on the sort of basics of, hey, maybe I'll just focus on Cooking, fucking, and learning how to be a decent person. Something like that.